She buried her husband on a Tuesday. By Friday, her own son changed the locks. At 68 years old, Evelyn Hart stood on the sidewalk outside the home she had lived in for 31 years, holding a single suitcase and a key to a garage she had never seen. No money, no plan, no one coming to help. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her husband had spent the last 2 years of his life building something extraordinary, something hidden, something that was about to change everything. If you've ever been underestimated, stay with me. This story is for you. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it hits you somewhere deep, hit that like button before we're done. I want to tell you something about grief that nobody warns you about. It doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't crash into you like a wave the way people describe it in movies, all slow motion and orchestral strings. Real grief comes in pieces. It comes when you reach for someone's coffee mug in the morning and remember they're not there to fill it. It comes when you hear a song on the radio that you danced to once, 30 years ago, in a kitchen that smelled like garlic and old wood. It comes at 4 in the afternoon when the light turns golden and you think, Daniel would love this light right now, and then you remember. And the remembering is like a second death, over and over and over again. My name is Evelyn Hart. I am 68 years old. And 3 weeks after I buried my husband of 41 years, my son locked me out of my own home. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, or rather, to what I thought was the end. Daniel Hart died on a Wednesday morning in late October, just as the leaves outside our bedroom window had turned the color of rust and honey. He went quietly, the way he had always moved through life, with a kind of careful dignity that I used to tease him about when we were young. "You're so controlled," I'd say, laughing. "Don't you ever want to just scream?" And he'd smile at me with that particular smile, the one that reached his eyes before it reached his mouth, and say, "I save my noise for the things that matter, Evie." I was 71. The cancer had been patient with him, or as patient as cancer can be, giving us almost 14 months between diagnosis and the end. 14 months of hospital appointments and medication schedules and conversations we should have been having for decades, but somehow never found the time for. 14 months of sleeping beside someone and being terrified every single morning that this would be the day you woke up alone. When that day came, I was holding his hand. That's the only thing I can say about it that doesn't break me open all over again. I was holding his hand, and then he was gone, and the room felt like it had lost all its air. I had thought, foolishly, I realize now, that the worst moment of my life was that Wednesday morning. I had no idea what was coming. The will reading was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral. Daniel had handled all of our legal and financial affairs for our entire marriage, which I know some people find shocking in this day and age, but that's simply how things had been. I was never excluded. That's important for you to understand. I was simply never particularly interested. Daniel was meticulous with money in a way that I, an art teacher for 30 years, simply was not. We had a good life, a beautiful life. Our penthouse on Meridian Boulevard was the physical proof of everything we'd built together. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound terrace, art on every wall. I trusted him completely. I trusted him so completely that I walked into Marcus Aldridge's law office on that particular Thursday afternoon, expecting to learn the logistics of a life I already assumed I understood. I wore the navy blazer Daniel had always liked on me. I had a notepad in my bag, though I'm not sure what I expected to write. Nathan sat beside me in a charcoal suit, scrolling through his phone until Aldridge entered the room. Nathan is our son, our only child. He was 43 at the time, sharp-looking the way a new knife is sharp, all edge and shine, not much warmth. He worked in commercial real estate development. He had Daniel's jaw and my height, and somehow, along the way, had acquired a sense of entitlement that neither of us had ever intended to give him. "Mrs. Hart," Aldridge said, settling his glasses on his nose and opening a file that seemed, to me, surprisingly thin. "Thank you for coming. I know this is a difficult time." I nodded. Nathan stopped scrolling. What followed was 12 minutes of legal language that I will compress for you now, because the technical details matter far less than the feeling of sitting in that chair and slowly understanding that something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The penthouse. Nathan. The investment portfolio. The brokerage accounts. The savings. Nathan. With a small monthly allowance designated to me that felt, when Aldridge named the figure, like something you'd give a college student for groceries. The art collection, the membership at Harborview Club, the car, the furniture, everything I had touched for 31 years, Nathan, and for Evelyn Margaret Hart, beloved wife, one property. A garage. At 14 Cortlandt Industrial Way, I heard Nathan make a sound beside me, a short, sharp exhale that was almost a laugh. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I was staring at Aldridge's mouth, watching words come out of it, trying to locate the part of my brain that was supposed to understand what was happening. "I'm sorry," I said. My voice was very calm. I remember being surprised by that. "Could you repeat that?" Aldridge repeated it. "A commercial garage property, registered under a subsidiary company, currently unoccupied. The deed would be transferred to my name." "A garage," I said. "Yes, ma'am." "Daniel left me a garage." "Yes." I sat with that for a long moment. The office was very quiet. Outside I could hear traffic, someone honking, the ordinary sounds of a city that had no idea what was happening in this room. "Was there a letter?" I asked. "Did he leave any explanation?" Aldridge opened the thin file and checked something. "Not with the will, no." Nathan cleared his throat. "Well," he said, and his voice had the particular quality it got when he was trying very hard to seem reasonable. "This is clearly what Dad wanted, so—" "Nathan," my voice was sharp. He stopped. I looked at Aldridge. "Is there anything else?" "No, Mrs. Hart. I'm afraid that's the complete document." I picked up my notepad. Blank. Every page of it blank. And I put it back in my bag, and I stood up and I walked out of that office with my spine straight and my hands folded because I was not going to let anyone in that building see me fall apart. I made it to the car before the shaking started. I drove home on autopilot. I don't remember traffic lights or turns. I just remember pulling into the garage of the Meridian building and sitting in the underground dark for a very long time trying to think clearly. Why? That was the only question that mattered. Why would Daniel, patient, careful, loving Daniel, why would he do this? Why would he leave me with nothing? After 41 years, after everything we had been to each other, after every sacrifice and compromise and quiet Tuesday night and hard conversation, why? I had no answer. Only the silence and the smell of engine oil and the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. I went upstairs. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat in the kitchen we had shared and looked at his reading glasses on the counter. He'd left them there the last morning he'd been well enough to sit up. And I told myself I would figure this out. I told myself Daniel had his reasons. I told myself to trust him the way I always had. I almost convinced myself. Then Nathan arrived. He didn't knock. He had a key, of course. He'd always had a key, since we'd moved in. But in 43 years of his life, Nathan had never let himself into our home without ringing the bell first. That night he walked straight in, suit jacket gone, tie loosened, and he had the look on his face that I had seen a handful of times over the years, and always dreaded. A look that said he had already decided something, and whatever came next was just the formality of announcing it. "Mom." He put his briefcase on the counter. My counter, I thought, then felt absurd for thinking it. "We need to talk." "Okay." I kept my voice neutral. "Do you want tea?" "I don't want tea. I want to have an honest conversation." "Then have one." He pulled out a stool at the kitchen island and sat down heavily. He had his phone face up on the counter. I noticed that. He always did that. Always left his phone face up, even when there was nothing on it, as though he needed it closed the way a child needs a security blanket. Daniel had mentioned it once, gently, and Nathan had snapped at him. I remember that. "The apartment," Nathan began. "What about it?" He shifted. "It's mine now, legally. Dad made it very clear. I know what the will said." "Right. So?" He looked at me directly then, and there was something in his eyes that I want to describe accurately because I never want to forget it. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was something more uncomfortable than cruelty. It was the look of a man who has talked himself into believing something terrible is actually practical. I've been thinking, and I've been talking to some people, and realistically, this apartment is a major asset, and I have plans for it that— "What kind of plans?" He paused. "Renovation, potentially renting it out while the market is good, converting the layout." He said it carefully, like he was reading from a prepared statement. "The point is, I'll need access to the space fairly quickly." I let that sentence sit there between us for a moment. Outside, the city glittered through the terrace window. 41 years of life around us in that kitchen. Nathan, I said, I live here. I know. And obviously that would be, we'd work out a transition period. A transition period, I repeated the word slowly. I'm 68 years old. Your father died 3 weeks ago. And you're asking me how quickly I can transition out of my home. I'm not asking you. I'm telling you there's a plan in place. You don't have a plan. My voice came out harder than I intended, and I watched Nathan blink, surprised. I had always been careful with my voice with him, always modulated, always the mother who managed. You have an opportunity that you're confusing for a plan. There's a difference. He stood up from the stool. And here's the moment that I want you to really hear, because this is the moment everything changed, even though I didn't understand that yet. He stood up, and he looked at me and he said, Mom, Dad left you a garage. That's what he thought was appropriate for you. I didn't make that choice. He did. He picked up his phone. I'll give you 2 weeks. There are some very nice senior communities on the north side, and I'm happy to help you look into... Get out. He stopped. Get out of this kitchen, I said. Get out of this apartment, right now. You can't... This is my home for 2 more weeks, by your own accounting. I walked to the front door and opened it. So for the next 2 weeks, when you want to come in, you knock. And tonight, you leave. He came toward me. He was a full foot taller than me and 43 years old, and there was a moment, a real moment, where I thought he was going to say something so devastating that I would never recover from it. Instead, he stopped in the doorway and said very quietly, The garage is worth nothing. I want you to understand that. Whatever Dad was thinking, that property is in one of the worst locations in the city. It's not going to save you. Then he left. I closed the door. I locked it. I went to the bathroom, turned on the faucet so no one could hear. There was no one to hear. I was alone. But some habits run deeper than logic, and I cried until I couldn't anymore. I spent those 2 weeks in a kind of suspended state. I went through Daniel's things carefully, reverently, the way you handle something you know can't be replaced. I kept his reading glasses. I kept the worn paperback of East of Eden that had lived on his nightstand for 15 years, so thoroughly read that the spine had given up entirely and the pages fanned loose. I kept the photograph from our second anniversary. We were 29 and 27, standing in front of a rental car somewhere in New Mexico, squinting against the sun and laughing at something I can't remember. I let Nathan take everything else. I didn't fight it. People thought I should. My friend Carol called me 3 times to say I should get my own lawyer, that the will could be contested, that Nathan couldn't simply take everything. Maybe she was right. But here's the truth, and I'm going to be honest with you the way I wish someone had been honest with me. I didn't fight it because I was too broken. Simple as that. Sometimes grief takes the fight right out of you, and you're left operating on some stripped-down survival setting that can only manage one thing at a time. The one thing I could manage was not letting Nathan see me beg. So on the last day, I packed 2 suitcases. I took a taxi because I didn't have a car anymore that had been in Daniel's name. I went to Carol's house, where I slept in her guest room and lay awake listening to her house settle and creak, feeling like a woman who had outlived her own life. Nathan texted me that night. Let me know if you need help finding something more permanent. I can ask around. I read it twice, put the phone face down on the nightstand, and didn't respond. I waited 4 more days before I went to the garage. I don't know what I was waiting for exactly. Maybe I needed the numbness to wear off enough that I could think clearly. Maybe I was afraid of what I'd find, or what I wouldn't find. A rusted box. A useless space. Proof that the man I had spent 41 years loving had, at the end, made some kind of terrible mistake about what I was worth. Carol offered to come with me. I told her no. Some things you have to face alone, even when you don't want to, especially when you don't want to. I took the bus to Cortland Industrial Way. It was a gray November morning, cold enough for my breath to show, and the street was exactly as uninviting as the name suggested. A long industrial block with chain link and concrete and loading docks. A scrap metal dealer on one end. A vacant lot on the other. Between them, a row of low commercial units, some occupied, some not, most showing the kind of slow decay that cities accumulate in the places they forget about. Number 14 was the 3rd unit from the left. It was larger than I'd expected, maybe 60 feet wide, with a broad roll-up door painted a dull charcoal gray that had oxidized in irregular patches. Above the door, faded almost to nothing, someone had stenciled the number 14, There was a regular entry door set into the side wall, heavy steel, with a combination lock beneath the handle. In my coat pocket, from the documents Aldridge had given me, was a folded card with a 6-digit code. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at that door for a long moment. Dad left you a garage. It's worth nothing. It's not going to save you. I walked up to the door. I entered the combination. The lock clicked open with a sound that was almost too loud in that quiet street, metallic and certain. I pushed the door open. The darkness inside was absolute. I fumbled along the wall with one hand, found a switch panel, flipped everything up, and the lights came on. I want you to understand something about the moment that followed, because I'm aware that what I'm about to describe sounds like the setup for something unbelievable. I want you to understand that I was standing there in my good coat with my grocery bag purse and my 68-year-old knees that ache in the cold, and I had been sleeping in my friend's guest room for a week, and I had cried so many times in the past 3 weeks that I had run out of the physical ability to cry. And then the lights came on. The space was enormous. The ceiling rose at least 20 feet, framed with exposed steel beams that had been recently painted black. The concrete floor had been sealed and polished to a smooth, almost mirror finish. The air was climate-controlled. I felt it immediately, that particular quality of preserved air that doesn't exist in neglected spaces. And along the walls, in bays separated by low wooden dividers, covered in fitted breathable fabric covers the color of cream. Cars. Not just cars. These cars. I walked to the nearest one and pulled the cover back with hands that were not quite steady. Beneath it was a deep burgundy two-door with a hood that curved like a held breath. Chrome trim that caught the overhead light and threw it back in long, clean lines. It was beautiful the way that old things made with extraordinary care are beautiful. Not flashy, not showing off, just quietly, undeniably perfect. I pulled the cover further. On the chrome strip along the side, Ferrari 250 GT. I didn't know cars. I want to be honest about that. I couldn't have told you, standing there, exactly what I was looking at. But I knew beautiful things. I had taught art for 30 years. I understood proportion and craftsmanship, and the particular language of something made by human hands with total devotion. And what I was looking at was, without question, extraordinary. I moved to the next bay. A long, low car, black, with a power and elegance that felt almost aggressive. I found the badge, Jaguar E-Type. The next one, a pale silver coupe, compact and purposeful, Porsche 356. There were 9 of them in total. I know that now. That morning I counted 3 before my legs stopped cooperating and I had to sit down on the cold concrete floor, my back against one of the wooden dividers, and just breathe. I sat there for a while. I don't know how long. Long enough for the cold to seep through my coat. Then I saw the envelope. It was taped to the wall beside the light switch panel, at eye level, slightly above it. A cream-colored envelope, the same kind Daniel had always bought, in bulk, because he maintained actual physical correspondence with people in an age when no one else did anymore. My name was written on it in his handwriting. His handwriting, present tense, somehow, in the middle of all that past. Evie. I got up off the floor. My knees protested. I didn't care. I walked to the envelope and took it down and stood there holding it for a moment because I wasn't sure I was ready. I opened it anyway. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, in the careful script that Daniel had developed in boarding school and never entirely lost, despite 60-odd years of computers and keyboards. I'm going to share parts of it with you here. Not all of it, because some of it is mine, but the parts that matter, the parts that explain everything. Evie, if you're reading this, then I ran out of time before I could figure out a better way to say all of this to your face. I'm sorry for that. I tried. A few times I even started the conversation and then lost my nerve, which I know will surprise you because you've always thought I was braver than I am. I need to tell you some things, and I need you to let me say them without interrupting, which is why I'm telling you in a letter. You always interrupted. I loved that about you. I had to stop reading for a moment. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and waited until I was sure I could continue. The cars in this garage are real, and they are worth more than you're imagining right now. I started acquiring them about 12 years ago through a company called Hartwell Classic Holdings, which holds this property and several related accounts. The details are all in the binder on the shelf to your right. I've worked with a man named Franklin Chu, his card is in the binder as well, who is a specialist in classic automobile sales and consulting. He's expecting your call. He knows everything. He's been discreet and he's trustworthy. I've known him for 8 years. I also want to tell you about the cottage. I looked up from the letter. The cottage. I had no idea what he was talking about. It's in a place called Carrow Bay, about 90 minutes north of the city. I bought it 4 years ago, also through Hartwell. It's been maintained by a property management company. It's small. I know you, Evie. I know you think you need more space than you do. But it has a porch that faces the water and a garden that goes all the way to the cliff edge. I've been meaning to take you there for years. I kept running out of time. I ran out of time for everything. Now I need to explain Nathan. I sat down again. The nearest car's hood was at my shoulder. I let myself lean against it slightly, just for the warmth of contact. I love our son. I want you to know that before I say anything else. I love him in the complicated, exhausted way you can only love someone you've watched grow up and seen go sideways, and I've never stopped hoping he'd find his way back. But Evelyn, I need you to understand that I was afraid of him. Not physically. I was afraid of what he was becoming, and I was afraid of what he might do if I left everything to both of you equally, or if I left your inheritance in a form that he could access, challenge, or manipulate. You would have let him. You always let him. That's not a criticism. It's the most loving thing about you, and it's also the thing that worried me most. The will gives Nathan what he's always wanted, the visible things, the status, the address. He'll feel like he won. What he won't know, unless you tell him, which is your choice entirely, is that I gave you the real thing, the garage, the cars, the cottage, the accounts attached to Hartwell. It's real wealth, Evie, life-changing wealth. Enough for you to never need anyone's permission again. Enough for you to live entirely on your own terms for the rest of your life, exactly the way you deserve. I'm sorry I waited so long to make sure you were safe. I'm sorry I assumed we had more time. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but I'm most sorry that I can't be there to see your face right now. I love you. I love you. I love you. Daniel Utty. I read the letter 4 times, there on the floor of that garage, with classic cars worth millions breathing quietly around me in the climate-controlled air. Then I found the binder. It was exactly where he said it would be, a thick navy 3-ring binder on a shelf that ran along the back wall, between a row of automotive reference books and a set of folded shop towels. It was labeled, in Daniel's handwriting, simply EV. I opened it. The first page was a net worth summary for Hartwell Classic Holdings. I had to read the number 3 times before it stayed still, long enough for me to believe it. I won't tell you the exact figure, but I will tell you this. Nathan had stood in a doorway and told me the garage was worth nothing. He had said it with the absolute confidence of a man who had already done the math on my life and found it negligible. He had been wrong by several $1,000,000. I sat on the cold concrete floor of a forgotten garage on an industrial street in a neighborhood no one thought twice about, and I did something I hadn't done in 3 weeks. I laughed. It started small, just a sound that surprised me, and then it got bigger, and my shoulders shook, and my eyes filled up again, but this time it was different. This time the fullness in my chest wasn't only grief. It was something older and more complicated. It was the feeling of a woman who thought she had lost everything, discovering that the man who loved her had been quietly building her a door this whole time. All she had to do was unlock it. I called Franklin Chu that afternoon from Carol's guest room. He answered on the second ring, as though he'd been half expecting the call, and his voice was steady and calm and entirely professional, which is exactly what I needed in that moment. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "I'm so sorry about Daniel. He was a remarkable man." "He was," I agreed. My voice was steady. I was still a little surprised by that. "I assume you found everything?" "I found the garage," I said, "and the binder. I haven't been to the cottage yet." "When you're ready," Franklin said simply. "There's no rush on any of this. I want you to understand that there's no urgency that I'm aware of, nothing that needs to happen on a tight timeline. We can move as slowly as you need." I looked out Carol's guest room window at the maple tree in her backyard, bare and gray against the November sky. "Actually," I said, "I think I've been moving slowly long enough." We set up a meeting for the following week. By the end of that conversation, I had a clearer picture of what Daniel had built, the extent of it, the years of patience it had required, the careful way he had structured everything so that it belonged entirely to me, not subject to any joint claim or legal challenge. He had been meticulous. He had been thinking about this for a long time. He had been thinking about me. That night, for the first time in 3 weeks, I slept without waking up. Ta-da! I want to tell you about the first time I saw Carro Bay. I drove up on a Saturday, renting a car, because I didn't have one yet. That would change soon. And following the GPS north on the coast highway, until the city released me and the landscape opened up into that particular wildness that California keeps on its northern edges, all cliff and salt wind and the particular gray-green of Pacific water under winter light. Carro Bay was a small town. That's the most accurate description. A main street with a hardware store and a bakery and a post office and a tavern that looked like it had been there since before anyone had thought to build the rest of the town around it. Maybe 800 people. Maybe less. The cottage was on Cliff Road, past the edge of town, up a gravel drive that wound through salt-bent pines. It was blue-gray with white trim, a covered porch facing the water, a garden that was dormant now but showed the bones of something that had been carefully planned. Stone paths, raised beds, a low wooden fence at the edge where the garden met the cliff. I parked and sat in the car for a moment. Then I got out and I stood on that porch and I looked at the Pacific Ocean. The water was enormous and cold and completely indifferent to everything that had happened to me in the past month, which was, I realized, exactly what I needed. Something that had no opinion about my grief or my circumstances or my age or what I was worth. Something that just was, enormous and silver and continuous on and on to the horizon. I unlocked the front door with a key Franklin had sent by courier. Inside, it smelled like old wood and the particular clean saltiness of a coastal space. The furniture was simple: a couch, a kitchen table, 2 chairs, a wood stove. Nothing grand, nothing like the Meridian penthouse. But there was a reading chair by the window that looked directly at the ocean, and beside it, a small side table. On the side table, propped against a ceramic lamp, was a photograph I recognized immediately. It was from our trip to New Mexico. The same trip as the anniversary photo I'd kept, but a different shot. Daniel had his arm around my shoulders, and we were both squinting into the sun, and whoever had taken the photo had caught us mid-laugh, neither of us looking at the camera, both of us looking at each other. I didn't remember packing it. I hadn't packed it. It had been here already. Daniel had put it there. At some point in the last 4 years, he had come to this place he had built for me, and he had placed this photograph on this table, and then he had come home, and he had never said a word. I sat down in the reading chair and I looked at the ocean, and I thought about 41 years, about the weight of being truly known by another person, about how rare that is, and how casually we sometimes carry it, not understanding its value until we're holding it in both hands, trying not to drop it. I thought about Daniel saying, "I save my noise for the things that matter, Evie." He had been building this for years, quietly, carefully, without noise, saving it for the thing that mattered most. I was the thing that mattered most. I stayed in Carro Bay that night, sleeping in the small bedroom that smelled like cedar and sea air under a quilt I didn't recognize. New, never used, the tag still tucked into the corner. He had bought it for me. He had thought about what quilt I would want. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of waves and fog, and I made coffee in a kitchen that was mine, and I stood at the window and watched the water, and I started, slowly and imperfectly, and with no particular clear plan, to figure out what came next. I want to be honest with you about one more thing before we leave this first chapter of the story, because I don't want to make this sound more graceful than it was. I was angry at Daniel too. I know that sounds ungrateful, given what he had done for me. I know it sounds small. But somewhere in those first days in Carro Bay, beneath the relief and the overwhelming love I felt reading his letter, there was also this. Why didn't you tell me? Why did I have to sit in a lawyer's office and feel the floor drop out from under me? Why did I have to stand in a garage in the cold, not knowing if I was about to find a rusted, empty room? Why did I have to live through Nathan changing the locks on a Tuesday evening when I could have known, could have been prepared, could have walked out of that apartment with my head up instead of feeling like a woman who had been discarded? Daniel had his reasons. I understand them now, in hindsight. The concern about Nathan, the desire for a clean legal separation, the belief that I needed to discover this myself rather than be handed it. I understand the chess move logic of it, but I still wished he'd trusted me with it while he was alive. I wished I could have said, "Thank you," while you're still here to hear it. That's grief too, I suppose. Not just losing the person, but losing all the conversations you didn't have. Grief is the museum of everything you meant to say. I put the letter back in its envelope. I put the envelope in my bag, in the inside pocket, where I keep the things I want close. And I went out to stand on the cliff edge garden in the morning fog, with the Pacific moving below me, cold and enormous and entirely without opinion, and I started to get very, very clear about what I was going to do next. Franklin Cho was not what I expected. I had imagined, for some reason, someone older. Someone who matched the vintage of the cars in that garage, all leather elbow patches and measured speech. Instead, Franklin was in his mid-50s, compact and energetic, with the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. He met me at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the garage on a Tuesday morning, arrived 5 minutes early, already had tea waiting because Daniel had apparently told him I preferred it, and spent the first 10 minutes asking me questions about myself before he said a single word about the cars or the money. That detail mattered to me. That's how I knew Daniel had chosen correctly. He talked about you constantly, Franklin said at one point, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup. Not in a sentimental way, or not only. He talked about you the way people talk about someone they're trying to protect. He was very deliberate about that word, protection. He never told me any of this was happening, I said. It still stung, even then. 12 years, and I had no idea. Franklin nodded slowly. He struggled with that. I can tell you that honestly. There were at least 3 occasions over the years where he told me he was going to tell you, and then he'd go quiet for a few weeks and come back and say he'd decided to wait. He paused. I think he was afraid that if you knew, you'd feel like he was planning for his death. And he didn't want your whole life to smell like that. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the coffee shop, the November street moved past the window. People going to work, a delivery truck, a woman walking a dog that kept stopping to inspect every crack in the sidewalk. He wasn't wrong, I finally said. I would have made it weird. Franklin smiled. It was the first real smile I'd seen on anyone in weeks that didn't feel like it was managing me. He knew you very well. He did. I picked up my tea. All right, tell me everything. So he did. The full picture of what Daniel had built over 12 years was more structured than I had understood from the binder alone. Hartwell Classic Holdings had been incorporated quietly, with a small accountancy firm doing the books and Franklin managing the acquisitions and maintenance of the vehicles. The cars had been purchased at different times, through different channels, estate sales, private collections, specialized auctions, and each acquisition had been documented and authenticated with the obsessive care that Daniel applied to everything he considered important. The collection as it stands, Franklin said, setting a printed summary on the table between us, conservatively appraised at $4.3 million. That's a floor, not a ceiling. The 61 Ferrari alone in the current market could fetch significantly more depending on the buyer. I looked at the number on the page. It didn't feel real. It felt like a number from someone else's story, someone's movie, not from my life, not from a garage on Cortlandt Industrial Way that smelled like machine oil and preserved leather. He also maintained a separate investment account under the Hartwell umbrella, Franklin continued. Not touched in 3 years. It's grown since he set it aside. That's detailed on page 4. I turned to page 4. It took me a moment to locate the number, and when I did, I set the page down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid of breaking. Franklin, I said, yes. I need you to be very straight with me right now. I will be. Is all of this legitimate? Is there anything here that could come back on me, legally, tax-wise, any of it? He met my eyes directly. Daniel spent considerable money making sure that there isn't. This was built to survive legal scrutiny. That was one of his primary requirements from day one. Because of Nathan. A small pause. He didn't say that specifically, but yes, I believe so. I nodded. My hands were steady, which still surprised me. 3 weeks ago, I had shaken for an hour in an underground parking garage. Now I was sitting in a coffee shop learning that my husband had quietly built me an empire, and my hands were steady. Grief is strange that way. It sandpapers you down to something harder at the core. What would you recommend? I asked. As a first step, Franklin leaned back slightly. My recommendation is to do nothing dramatic for 60 days. Don't sell anything. Don't announce anything. Don't make any large decisions. Let the legal transfer to your name complete. That's already in process. Spend time at the cottage. Get used to the idea of what you have before you decide what to do with it. That's not very exciting advice. No, he agreed. But Daniel asked me to say it if you seemed like you were about to move fast. He smiled slightly. He knew you very well. I thought about the photograph on the side table, about a cedar-scented bedroom and a quilt with its tags still tucked in, about a man who had planned a room for me in a house I'd never seen, down to the detail of which photo would be waiting on the table. 60 days, I said. 60 days. Fine, fine. I picked up my tea. And after 60 days? After 60 days, Franklin said, you'll be a woman who knows exactly what she has and exactly what she wants to do with it. And then we can start moving. I drove back to Carroll Bay that afternoon feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happy. That would have been too simple and too quick. But something underneath happiness. Something structural. Something that felt, for the first time in weeks, like a floor I could actually stand on. The first month in Carroll Bay was strange, in the way that all real transitions are strange. Not graceful, not cinematic, just disorienting and occasionally tedious and punctuated by small, unexpected moments of something almost like peace. I learned the rhythms of the cottage. The pipes were loud in the morning. The garden gate had a latch that required a specific upward pressure to catch properly. And if you didn't know the trick, it swung open whenever the wind came off the water. The fog came in most evenings around 4 o'clock, thick enough that the cliff edge disappeared and the ocean sounds changed, muffled but somehow closer, more present. I walked every day. That was the thing I held on to. Every morning, regardless of weather, I put on my coat and my waterproof shoes, and I walked the cliff path from the cottage into town and back, 2 miles each way, stopping at the bakery on Main Street for coffee I didn't really need. The woman who ran the bakery was named Simone. She was in her late 50s, originally from somewhere in Louisiana, and she had the particular easy warmth of someone who has spent decades feeding people and found genuine satisfaction in it. The first time I came in, she poured my coffee and asked my name, and when I told her, she said, "You're in the blue cottage on Cliff Road, aren't you? We've been waiting for someone to actually move in. The garden's been going to seed." "I know," I said. "I'm going to deal with it in the spring." "You know about gardening?" "A little. My husband—" I stopped. That gap again, that air pocket where a sentence should be. "My husband had a vegetable garden when we were first married. I helped sometimes." Simone looked at me with the direct, unsentimental eyes of someone who has heard a lot of half-finished sentences and knows how to sit with them. "Coffee's on the house today," she said simply. "Welcome to Carroll Bay." I won't pretend those early weeks were a recovery. They weren't. Recovery implies a clean arc, a before and after, a measurable progress. What those weeks actually were was a series of very small choices about whether to engage with life or not, whether to open the curtains, whether to cook a real meal or just eat crackers and tea, whether to return Carol's calls, which came every 2 or 3 days with a kind of stubborn regularity that I found both exhausting and deeply moving. I returned them. Not every time, but enough. Carol came up for a weekend in early December. She brought wine and a casserole and a relentless practicality that was, frankly, exactly what I needed. She walked every room of the cottage with the appraising eye of someone who had spent 30 years in interior design, said Daniel had good taste 3 times, asked no questions about money or the will or Nathan, and sat with me on the porch at 9 o'clock at night, wrapped in a blanket, while we drank wine and watched the invisible ocean sound itself in the dark. "I'm okay," I told her at some point, and was startled to realize I meant it partially. "I know you are," she said. "You're the toughest person I know, Evelyn. I've always thought that. I'm not tough. I'm just stubborn. Same thing with better marketing." I laughed. A real laugh, not the broken kind from the garage. The kind that leaves you feeling slightly lighter afterward. It was the night after Carol left that Nathan called. I almost didn't answer. I looked at his name on the screen and had a solid 15 seconds of genuine deliberation. Not dramatic, just honest, before I picked up. "Hi, Nathan." "Mom." His voice was careful, professionally neutral. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know. Carol told me you're somewhere north of the city." I made a note to talk to Carol about that, then immediately forgave her, because she was Carol and she worried, and you couldn't be angry at someone for caring even when their caring was inconvenient. "I'm fine," I said. "How are you?" He stopped. "Why didn't you tell me where you were going?" "Because you changed the locks on my home, Nathan." The line went quiet for a moment. The apartment isn't, he started. I know what the apartment is. You don't need to explain it to me. I kept my voice even. This was something I'd been practicing, without fully realizing I was practicing it, maintaining an even voice when speaking to my son. Not cold, not angry, just measured. What did you call about? I wanted to make sure you were all right. A pause. And I wanted to... There are some papers you need to sign for the estate transfer. It would be easier if you came back to the city. Have them mailed to me, Mom, or have Aldridge email them to me digitally. I can sign electronically. You don't need me there in person, Nathan, and I'm not ready to come back to the city yet. Another pause. Longer this time. Where are you exactly? I'm somewhere comfortable, I said. I'm safe. That's all you need to know right now. That's... He exhaled, and for a moment he sounded genuinely frustrated rather than strategically frustrated, and the difference was audible. Mom, I'm your son. I'm not the enemy here. I thought about the doorway, the way he'd looked at me. The garage is worth nothing. It's not going to save you. I know you're my son, I said carefully. And I know you're not entirely the person you were in that conversation 3 weeks ago. People aren't just one moment. I know that. I let a breath out. But I need time. I need space. And when I'm ready to come back and sit across a table from you, I will tell you. Not before. He didn't say anything for a long moment. The penthouse renovation starts in January, he finally said, and I understood that we had moved back to the practical because the emotional was too uncomfortable for him to stay in long. There are some pieces of furniture, things of yours, that I want you to have the chance to collect before the contractor comes in. Make a list and send it to me. I'll tell you what I want and you can have it delivered. Mom, that's... or donated. I'm comfortable either way. Nimata sound, half breath, half something else. Then, fine, I'll send the list. Thank you, Nathan, he said goodbye. I stayed on the porch after he hung up, looking out into the dark where the ocean was, listening to the water work itself against the rocks below the cliff, relentless and indifferent and beautiful in its indifference. People aren't just one moment. I believed that. I genuinely believed it. The question was whether I believed it enough to act on it before Nathan gave me a reason not to, and that question I couldn't answer yet. I went inside. I made tea. I sat in the reading chair by the window and opened the Hartwell binder to a section I hadn't read carefully yet, the one about the car's individual histories. And I spent the next hour reading about a 1961 Ferrari that had once belonged to a Belgian industrialist and had been kept in a climate-controlled cellar for 30 years before Daniel had found it through an estate sale in Geneva. He had traveled to Geneva for it. He had traveled to Geneva and looked at this car in a Belgian man's cellar, and brought it back and built a sanctuary for it in a forgotten garage in a city that didn't care, all for me, all of it, always for me. I pressed my thumb against his handwriting on the binder's label, Evie, and I thought, I need to be worthy of this. Not of the money, of the faith, of what it means to be loved that carefully by another person. I wasn't sure I knew how yet, but I was starting to understand the shape of it. It was during the 5th week, after Christmas, which I spent at Carol's with deliberate quietness, turkey, and 2 bottles of good wine and a board game we abandoned after 2 rounds, that I started making decisions. Not dramatic ones. Franklin had been right about that. What I found, in the silence of those weeks, was that good decisions don't usually feel dramatic when you make them. They feel like the next logical step after you've cleared enough space to see clearly. The first decision was about the cars. I called Franklin in early January, sitting at the kitchen table with the Hartwell binder open and the ocean visible through the window, frost on the garden, and the water the color of pewter. I don't want to sell all of them, I told him. Okay, he said without surprise. I want to keep one. I had thought about this for a while. The Aston Martin. There was a 1965 Aston Martin DB5 in the 5th Bay. Dark blue, understated, the kind of beautiful that doesn't need to make noise about it. It had been Daniel's most recent acquisition. He bought it last. He chose it knowing he was sick. I think that one meant something specific to him. It did, Franklin said quietly. He talked about it differently than the others. I'm going to keep it. I'm not going to drive it. Not yet, maybe not ever. But I want it. That's your right, absolutely. The others, I want to sell, but not all at once. I don't want to flood the market. I want to do it right, the way Daniel would have done it. One at a time, to the right buyers. No rushing. That's exactly the correct approach, Franklin said, and I could hear something in his voice that I thought was approval, or maybe relief. That's what he would have said. I know. I looked at the binder. And I want to start a foundation. A beat of silence. Tell me more, Franklin said. I was an art teacher for 30 years. I know what it means to be in a school that doesn't have resources. I know what it means to be a kid who needs something, a creative outlet, a skill, a person who sees them, and to be in a place that can't provide it. I took a breath. I want to do something real with part of this money, not just donate to something that already exists, something I build, a financial education component, Franklin said slowly. Given the amount, it might make sense to think about both the arts and financial literacy. There's a gap there, especially in lower income communities. I stopped, looked at the window, the frost on the garden. That's a good idea, I said. Daniel mentioned something like that once, the financial literacy piece. He was bothered that wealth management was something only people who already had wealth really understood. Of course he had mentioned it. Of course he had been thinking about it, quietly, in that way he had. Write that down for me, I said. I want to talk about it properly at our next meeting. Already done, Franklin said. I sat at the table after hanging up and looked at the ocean for a long time. The pewter water, the frost, the garden that needed tending. I was 68 years old. I had 2 suitcases to my name, a garage full of extraordinary cars I was going to sell with care and intention, a cottage by the sea that smelled like cedar, and a letter in my inside pocket from a man who had loved me for 41 years and spent the last 2 of them making sure I would be all right. I was all right, more than all right, really. I was beginning. But I hadn't counted on how quickly Nathan would start pulling at threads he didn't yet know were connected, or how fast everything would unravel once he did. That part of the story was still coming, and when it came, it was going to be worse than I had allowed myself to imagine. The first sale happened in late February. Franklin handled it with the quiet efficiency I had come to associate with everything Daniel had touched. The buyer was a private collector in Portland, a man who had apparently been looking for a 1958 Porsche 356 in that specific configuration for almost 7 years. The transaction was clean, properly documented, and deposited into the Hartwell account within 10 days of the vehicle leaving the garage. When Franklin texted me the confirmation, I was standing in the cottage garden in rubber boots trying to clear the dead growth from the raised beds, my hands dirty and my knees complaining, and I read the number and then stood there for a moment with my phone in my muddy glove. It was more money than I had earned in 4 years of teaching. For a single car, one of 9. I put the phone back in my pocket and went back to pulling dead stems out of the ground, because there was something clarifying about physical work, about the resistance of roots and frozen soil, that no amount of financial revelation could replicate. I needed to feel ordinary sometimes. I needed dirt under my fingernails and an aching back to remind myself that I was still a person living a physical life and not just a number in a binder. That evening I called Carol and told her. She was quiet for a moment and then said very carefully, Evelyn, are you telling me that Daniel was secretly a car person this whole time? Apparently. He drove a Volvo. I know. A gray Volvo. Carol, I'm just saying that man contained multitudes. I laughed, and it was the good kind. And afterward we talked for an hour about nothing important, her daughter's new apartment, a book we had both read 20 years ago that Carol had found in a thrift store, the hydrangeas I was planning for the east side of the cottage garden. Normal conversation, the kind that doesn't carry any weight but holds you together anyway. I went to bed that night feeling something that I want to describe carefully, because I don't want to overstate it. I felt, for the first time since Daniel's death, that the future was a real thing, not something to be managed or survived, but an actual direction, a place I was moving toward rather than a wall I was pressed against. I should have known that was exactly when things would start to come apart. It was Carol who told me, though she didn't mean to. We were on the phone in early March, and she mentioned, casually, the way you mention things when you don't realize they matter, that she'd run into Nathan at a restaurant in the city, that he'd asked about me, that she'd told him I seemed well, that I was settling in somewhere comfortable, and that the conversation had been brief and unremarkable. Did he seem curious? I asked. About where I was specifically. A small pause. A little. I didn't tell him where, if that's what you're asking. I just said north of the city, which I'd told him before. Did he ask about anything else? He asked if I knew what you were living on. She said it carefully, like she understood now that it mattered. I said I assumed you had savings. He seemed, I don't know, skeptical. I understood then. Nathan was a man who dealt in real estate, in asset values, in the ledger logic of what things were worth. He had calculated my inheritance and found it negligible. And now I had been gone for 4 months, living somewhere, clearly not in financial distress, and the math wasn't adding up for him. He was starting to look more carefully. I called Franklin the next morning. If someone started pulling property records, I said, how visible is Hartwell? Franklin was quiet for a moment. Hartwell is incorporated as a private holding company. It's not secret. It's a legal entity. But it wouldn't appear in a standard public record search unless someone knew exactly what to look for. The property at Cortland is registered under the company name. And the cottage? Also under a subsidiary, a different name. So nothing's directly in my name yet. The legal transfer is about 60% complete, he said. Some of it is already in your name. The bank accounts, primarily. If Nathan hired someone, a private investigator, or even just a sharp accountant, could they find this? Another pause. Longer. Eventually, possibly. It would take effort. It wouldn't be immediate. He paused again. Mrs. Hart, is there a specific reason you're asking? I think Nathan is starting to wonder where I'm living, I said. And I think when Nathan wonders about something related to money, he doesn't stop wondering until he has an answer. Do you want me to accelerate the legal transfer to your name? Would that make it easier to find or harder? Once it's in your name, it's a matter of public record. Right now, the company structure provides a layer of distance. I thought about this for a moment. Outside, the March garden was showing the first insistent green of things, coming back. Crocuses along the stone path. The hydrangea canes I'd planted, fattening with new buds. Leave it for now, I said. Let the process run at its current pace, but I want you to let me know immediately if anyone contacts you with questions about Hartwell, anyone at all. Of course. I put the phone down and looked at the garden and thought about my son's methodical, real estate-trained brain working at a problem he didn't fully understand yet. I had maybe 2 months before he found something, maybe less if he was motivated. What I didn't anticipate was that he'd find it in 3 weeks, and that it wouldn't be property records that led him there. It would be a car. I had made one mistake in those early months, and I want to be honest about it, because I think honesty matters more than appearing competent. The mistake was the Porsche. Before Franklin arranged the sale, he had the car professionally photographed for the buyer. Standard practice, he told me. Documentation for insurance and provenance records. Those photographs were taken inside the garage at Cortland, and they were perfectly ordinary photographs of a perfectly extraordinary car. The photographer was professional. The images were sent to the buyer privately, but photographers keep portfolios. And this particular photographer, a young man in his late 20s who specialized in automotive work, had uploaded one image to his professional website. A single photograph, a 3/4 rear shot of the Porsche inside the garage, beautiful in the way that old machines in good light are beautiful. He'd captioned it with the make and year and nothing else. No location, no client name. Nathan found it in late March. I don't know how. Some combination of image searching and the specific obsessive thoroughness that my son applied to things he believed were owed to him. He found the photograph, identified the garage interior from a detail I hadn't noticed and wouldn't have noticed, and cross-referenced property records on Cortland Industrial Way until he found Hartwell Classic Holdings registered at number 14. I know all of this because he told me. Later, in the confrontation, he told me exactly how he'd found it, and there was a particular pride in his voice as he described the process. The pride of a man who believes that finding a thing entitles him to it. The first I knew any of this was happening was a Saturday afternoon in late March when I was at Simone's Bakery, sitting at the window table with coffee and a book I wasn't really reading, when my phone rang and Nathan's name appeared on the screen. Something about the timing felt wrong. He usually called on Sunday evenings, as though he'd scheduled it the way he scheduled everything else. I answered. I know about the cars, he said. No greeting, no preamble. Just that. I put my book down. Outside the bakery window, Carrow Bay's Main Street was doing its Saturday thing. A few tourists, locals running errands, the hardware store owner sweeping his sidewalk with the same broom he seemed to have been using since the town was founded. Okay, I said. Okay? His voice sharpened. That's all you have to say? What would you like me to say, Nathan? I'd like you to explain why you've been living up there, so wherever you are, while sitting on a collection of classic cars worth. I don't even know how much they're worth, because nobody will talk to me. They won't talk to you because it's none of your business. The line went very quiet. When Nathan spoke again, his voice had dropped to that particular register it got when he was working very hard to control himself. Mom, I am Dad's son. Whatever he built, Your father's will was very specific, I said. You received everything he designated for you. The penthouse, the accounts, the portfolio. Everything that was in his name and intended for you. And he also apparently had an entirely separate company with millions of dollars worth of assets that were never mentioned in the will. They were mentioned. You received what was designated for you. I received what was designated for me. A garage, Nathan said, and the word came out like he was throwing it. He left you a garage. That's what Aldridge said. Nobody said anything about a collection. Nathan. I kept my voice very even. I was proud of myself for that, genuinely. I'm not going to discuss the details of my inheritance with you, just as I would expect you not to need my approval for what you do with yours. This is different. How? Because he hid it, because he built something and kept it secret and didn't account for it in the will, and that is, Mom, that is legally questionable. I've talked to an attorney. My hand tightened slightly on the phone. You've talked to an attorney, I said. I'm not threatening anything. I'm just saying that there are questions about whether assets that weren't disclosed in the estate. Everything was disclosed, I said. Everything was properly documented and legally structured. If your attorney is suggesting otherwise, they're wrong, or they're telling you what you want to hear, and neither of those serves you well. Silence. Then, I want to see it. No. Mom? No, Nathan. Not now. Maybe not ever. I haven't decided. You're keeping me away from something my father built. Your father built it for me. The steadiness left my voice a little, right there, and I heard it, and I knew he heard it too. He built it for me, specifically, deliberately, and with full legal intention. I'm not keeping you from something that belongs to you. I'm protecting something that belongs to me. Another silence. This one felt different, heavier, like something shifting in the architecture of the conversation. I want to come see you, he said finally. And this time the strategic sharpness was gone from his voice, or mostly gone, and what was underneath it was something I hadn't heard in a long time, something younger. Not about the cars, not about any of it. I want to come, and I want to talk to you face to face. I looked out the window at Simone wiping down the counter at the other end of the bakery. At the Saturday street outside. At the life of this small town going about itself without any interest in my family's fractures. Give me 2 weeks, I said. Then call me again and we'll talk about it. I hung up before he could respond. I gave him 10 days. I needed to do something before I let Nathan anywhere near me in person, and that thing was to have a conversation I had been putting off. I drove to the city on a Tuesday. A 2-hour drive I made in Daniel's Aston Martin, which I had finally decided to move to a more secure storage facility closer to Carroll Bay, and which I was not yet ready to admit I was using for personal trips, because that felt like a story I wasn't sure how to tell myself. It drove like it had opinions, like it knew where it wanted to go and was tolerating my directions. I met with a family law attorney named Patricia Osei, who came recommended by the firm that had handled the Hartwell documentation. She was in her mid-40s, measured and precise, with the kind of office that suggested she had dealt with wealthy people's complicated family situations for long enough that very little surprised her anymore. I sat across her desk and told her everything, all of it. The will reading, Nathan, the garage, the letter, Hartwell, the cars. I told it in order, without editorializing, the way I had learned to do over the past 4 months. When I was done, she made a few notes and then looked up. Your husband's estate planning was very thorough, she said. What he built around Hartwell is not legally ambiguous. The assets were his to allocate as he chose. They were properly documented. Taxes were filed and current. Your son has no legal claim. He mentioned talking to an attorney about undisclosed assets. Any attorney worth their license will tell him the same thing I'm telling you. She set her pen down. The question isn't legal, it's personal. I know. He's going to push. Based on what you've described, this is a man accustomed to getting what he feels entitled to, and he now believes something was kept from him by his own father. She paused. That's a painful thing to sit with. Some people, when they're in pain, go looking for someone to make pay for it. I'm aware. My advice is this. If he threatens litigation, don't flinch and don't negotiate. His case is weak and he'll know that. What he wants isn't the money, or not only the money. He wants an explanation. He wants his father to have meant something different than he meant. I looked at the window behind her desk. The city, gray and busy, moving at its own speed. His father meant exactly what he said, I said quietly. I know. But that doesn't make it easier to be the person who has to tell him. I drove back to Carrow Bay in the Aston Martin, and I thought about Daniel the whole way. About what he had seen in Nathan that he'd been afraid to say to me while he was alive. About the long, patient sadness of watching your child become something that disappointed you. About how much you could love someone and still not be able to fix them. About the letter's most painful line. I feared the man Nathan was becoming. Not past tense. Present continuous. A fear that had grown alongside a hope that never entirely died. I owed Nathan the truth of that letter. I had known it for months, carried it like a weight, and I had been waiting until I was strong enough to deliver it without collapsing under it. I was strong enough now. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, the second week of April. I had told him the address, finally, and he had driven up from the city in his black SUV and appeared in the cottage driveway looking. And I want to describe this honestly because it matters. Looking slightly undone. Not disheveled, not dramatically so. Just not the sealed, pressed version of himself that he usually presented. His jacket was wrinkled and he hadn't shaved, and when I opened his door, he looked at me with an expression that I couldn't immediately categorize, and then looked past me at the cottage, and the slice of ocean visible over the garden wall. Nice place, he said. It came out complicated. Come in, I said. I had made coffee. I didn't know if he'd want it, but I needed something to do with my hands during the opening minutes of whatever this was going to be. He sat at the kitchen table and wrapped his hands around the mug and looked around the cottage with those sharp, appraising eyes. And I watched him calculate things, the way he always calculated things, and I waited. How long have you had this? He asked. Since November, I said. Your father bought it 4 years ago. Nathan looked at the table. 4 years ago, he was already planning all of this. Yes. While we were all just... He stopped. His jaw moved. I had dinner with him, 6 months before he died, right here in the city. He sat across from me and we talked about my projects, my deals, and he never said a single word about any of this. No, I agreed. He didn't. How is that? How does someone do that? There was genuine bewilderment in his voice underneath the anger. How do you sit across from your son and just lie? He didn't lie, Nathan. He omitted. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one right now. It feels like a lie. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. He caught it, straightened, pressed his mouth into a line. It feels like he sat there and looked at me and decided I didn't deserve to know. I was quiet for a moment. The ocean was audible through the kitchen window. It was a windy day, the water louder than usual, restless. He left you a letter, I said. In my letter. About you. Nathan looked up. I had made a copy. I want to be clear about that. The original was in my inside pocket where it had lived for 4 months, and what I set on the table between us was a carefully made copy on plain paper. My original was mine, but the words were his to hear. He read it slowly. I watched his face. I watched the moment he reached the line about fearing the man he was becoming. Watched Nathan's expression do something complicated and private that I had not seen on his face since he was a teenager, and trying very hard not to let me see him hurt. He put the pages down. He didn't speak for a long time. He was afraid of me, Nathan said finally. He was afraid for you, I said carefully. There's a difference there too. That's a generous reading, maybe, but I knew your father for 41 years, and I know the difference between how he expressed fear of someone and how he expressed fear for them. He was afraid for you. He thought you were going somewhere he couldn't follow and couldn't stop. Nathan pushed the copy away slightly. Not violently, just a small distancing gesture. And you? Did you agree with him? Honesty, I told myself. Not cruelty. Honesty. I worried about you, I said. Separately, in my own way, for my own reasons. I watched you get harder as you got more successful, and I told myself it was ambition, and that ambition wasn't a bad thing. But I noticed. I always noticed. His eyes were red at the edges. I was working very hard to manage that, and part of me wanted to tell him he didn't have to, and another part knew that he wasn't ready to hear it. The cars, he said, after a moment. Back to the practical. The money. All of it. He looked at me steadily. I want you to know I'm not going to fight it legally. My attorney told me the same thing your attorney told you, probably. Dad built it cleanly. It's yours. I hadn't been certain he would say this, and my relief was real. Thank you, I said. I want you to know something else. He looked at the table again, then back at me. When I told you the garage was worthless, when I said... He stopped, started again. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I genuinely believed it. I thought he'd made some kind of mistake or some impulsive gesture, and I thought I was being realistic by... Nathan, he stopped. I know, I said. I believe you that you believed it. I let that sit for a moment. But you were also relieved when you thought it was worthless. Some part of you was relieved. He didn't deny it. That was the most honest thing he'd done in years, that not denying. Yeah, he said quietly. Some part of me was. We sat with that for a while. The coffee went cold. The ocean kept at it outside. I was not ready to forgive him. Not the way people mean when they use that word, as though it's a switch you flip and everything changes. Real forgiveness is slower than that and less dramatic and more like choosing, over and over, to stay in the room with someone instead of walking out. I was choosing to stay in the room. That was all I had for now. But it was something. There's something else I need to tell you, Nathan said. He said it with a quality that made me set my cup down. The penthouse renovation, he started. It's going well, the work itself, but He looked at his hands. I've made some financial decisions recently that are more complicated than I expected. Some investments that haven't... He stopped again. Nathan, I said slowly. What's happening? He looked up, and for the first time in this conversation, for the first time in maybe years, he looked like my son. Not the 43-year-old real estate developer with the SUV and the pressed suits. Just my son. I think I'm in trouble, he said. I think I'm in trouble. I had raised my son to be precise with language. Daniel had insisted on it, actually. He'd believed that imprecise speech was the first symptom of imprecise thinking, and he'd pushed Nathan on it from the time Nathan was old enough to form arguments. So when Nathan said those 5 words and didn't elaborate immediately, I understood that he had chosen them with care. He wasn't saying he was stressed. He wasn't saying things were complicated or difficult or in flux. He was saying trouble. Specific, bounded, serious trouble. I waited. The wind off the water pressed against the cottage windows. The coffee between us was completely cold. The renovation, Nathan started again. The penthouse. I hired a contractor in December, top of the market. Everyone recommended him. It seemed like the right move for what I was planning to do with the space. He turned his mug in his hands. He pulled the permits, started the structural work, and then in February he informed me that the original load-bearing configuration was different from what the building plans showed. Decades-old discrepancy. To do what I wanted to do with the layout, I needed a structural engineer, a reassessment, new permits, and essentially double the original budget. How much over? He named a number. I kept my face still. That's significant, I said carefully. I know what it is, Mom. Not sharp, just tired. I had the liquidity to absorb it if everything else was running normally. But in January, I also moved a significant portion of the portfolio into a development deal with a partner of mine. Commercial mixed-use project, the kind of thing I've done 10 times. Except this one, he stopped. His jaw worked. The anchor tenant pulled out in March. Without the anchor tenant, the financing structure collapsed. My partner is negotiating with the bank, but the timeline is, it's not good. My capital is locked in something I can't extract. The renovation is eating money faster than I projected, and I have a mortgage on the penthouse that... You took a mortgage on the penthouse? I heard the surprise in my own voice before I could manage it. Nathan looked at me steadily. I needed liquidity for the development deal. The penthouse was my largest asset. It made logical sense at the time. Daniel's penthouse, I said. I didn't mean it as an accusation. It came out that way regardless. My penthouse, he said, quietly but firmly. By the terms of the will. My penthouse. We looked at each other across the kitchen table. Outside, the ocean. Always the ocean, enormous and indifferent. He was right. It was his. I had agreed to that, had walked away from it without fighting, had chosen dignity over contest. I couldn't retroactively claim emotional ownership of something I had legally relinquished. You're right, I said. I'm sorry. Go ahead. He seemed slightly surprised by the apology. He nodded once, slowly. The short version is that by June, I'm going to have a cash flow problem that I can't resolve on my own. The renovation has to either stop completely, which means the construction site sits open and the building has issues with me, or I find capital to finish it. The development deal won't free up my money for at least 8 to 12 months, probably longer. What are you asking me, Nathan? He looked at me directly. I'm not asking for anything yet. I wanted you to know what was happening. That's not entirely true, I said. Not unkind, just accurate. If you only wanted me to know, you could have called. You drove 2 hours to tell me this in person, and you told it to me right after we'd talked about the cars and the money. You know what you're building toward. I'm not criticizing that. I'm just naming it. He was quiet for a long moment, then, I might need help. Might. Will. He said it like it cost him something. I will need help. I stood up and took both mugs to the sink. I ran the water and rinsed them and set them on the rack and stood there for a moment with my back to him, looking at the garden through the window above the sink. The hydrangeas I had planted in March were showing the first leaf buds, tiny and green and impossibly hopeful, given how recently everything had been frozen. I turned around. I'm going to tell you something, I said, and I need you to hear it as information, not as an attack. He nodded. When you stood in the doorway of the apartment and told me the garage was worthless, you weren't being cruel on purpose. I believe that. But you were dismissing me. You had already decided what I was worth, and what I would need, and what trajectory the rest of my life would follow, and you made all of those decisions without consulting me, without respecting the 41 years I had lived in that apartment, without any real acknowledgement that I was a person with my own intelligence and my own resources and my own right to be treated like an adult. I paused. And then when things got hard for you, you drove 2 hours to find me. Nathan held my gaze. Whatever he was feeling, he was holding it. I know, he said. I'm not saying that to punish you. I want to be clear about that. I'm saying it because if we're going to have a real conversation about help, about what that might look like and under what conditions, then we have to be honest about what happened. We can't pretend it didn't. I'm not pretending. Good. I came back to the table and sat down. Then tell me everything, all of it, the real numbers, the real timeline, the real situation, not the version where you've already pre-managed how it makes you look, the actual truth. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read. Then something in him shifted. I saw it, a physical thing, like a wall deciding to come down. And he started talking. We sat at that kitchen table for 3 hours. He told me things he had clearly never told anyone. Not in those terms, not with that level of exposure. The development deal was worse than he'd initially described. His partner, a man named Garrett, who Nathan had worked with twice before, had been managing the anchor-tenant relationship poorly for months and hadn't disclosed it. Nathan had found out not from Garrett, but from a mutual contact in the industry, which meant there had been a deliberate concealment. I was weighing whether to take legal action against Garrett while simultaneously trying to salvage the deal, and the two impulses were pulling in opposite directions. The renovation contractor, it turned out, had also lowballed the original estimate in a way that Nathan now believed was not accidental. He had discovered this 3 weeks ago and was holding the information while he figured out what his options were. So you're being taken advantage of in 2 directions simultaneously, I said. That's one way to put it. Is there a more accurate way? He almost smiled. No, that's accurate. How much do you need and for how long? He put a number on the table. It was large, not devastating to what I had, but large. Enough that it couldn't be a casual gesture. Enough to matter. That would cover the renovation to completion and give me enough operating cushion to get through the next 6 months without the development deal, he said. After 6 months, the deal should have resolved one way or another. And if it resolves badly, then I sell the penthouse. And if the renovation isn't complete when you sell, then I sell it as is and take the loss. I studied my son's face. He was not comfortable with this conversation. I could see the effort it cost him to sit still in it, to answer my questions without deflecting, to not reach for the strategic polish he usually kept between himself and any situation that might expose him. He was doing it anyway. That mattered. I'm going to tell you what I can do, I said, and I need you to listen without interrupting, and then you can respond. He nodded. I can help. Financially, I can help. But I'm not writing a check and walking away because that would be the worst thing I could do for both of us. What I can do is connect you with someone, a financial advisor, independent, not connected to any of your current projects, who will look at your actual position and give you an honest assessment. If that assessment supports what you've told me today, then we talk about terms. Terms, Nathan repeated. Conditions, requirements, things that have to be true for money to move. I looked at him steadily. I'm not punishing you, but I'm also not your backup plan, Nathan. If I'm going to be part of your financial situation, it needs to be structured like a real thing, with oversight and accountability and honesty. Not because I don't trust you. You don't trust me, he said. Not accusatory, just plain. I don't have a recent record of trusting you, I said carefully. That's different. Trust is built. We haven't built it yet, not in the right ways. This could be part of building it, if you're willing to do it honestly. He sat with that. I watched him process it, watched the various responses move across his face before he settled on the one he actually meant. Okay, he said. Okay what? Okay to the advisor. Okay to the conditions. A pause. Okay to all of it. I nodded. I didn't express relief because I wasn't only relieved. I was also something more complicated, something that mixed relief with caution and old hurt, and the particular wariness of a woman who had been dismissed by this person 4 months ago and had not entirely forgotten the specific quality of that dismissal. There's one more thing, I said. What? The penthouse. He looked at me. I held his gaze. I want you to consider selling it regardless, not because you have to, because I think you should. He blinked. Why? Because I think you have been chasing the wrong version of success for a long time, and that apartment is the physical representation of it. You were going to renovate it, rent it, flip it. It was always a transaction to you, never a home. And I think part of what's happened in the last year is that you've been trying to prove something, to yourself or to your father or to someone, and that proving has cost you your judgment. I paused. Sell it, clear the debt. Start from a real place instead of a leveraged one. Bant Sishi. The silence that followed was the longest of the afternoon. Dad would have said the same thing, Nathan said finally. I know. I didn't want to hear it from him either. I know that too. He looked out the window at the garden, at the small green beginning of things. He looked like he was very tired, and also, under the tiredness, very young in a way that broke my heart a little. The way your children can suddenly look their original age, the age they were before all the accumulation of choices and armor. I'll think about it, he said. That was enough for now. That was actually more than I had expected. The financial advisor I connected Nathan with was a woman named Sandra Rice, who came recommended through the same network that had produced Patricia Osei. She was exacting and clear-eyed and had the particular quality of someone who has been lied to by wealthy clients enough times that she had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect it. Nathan met with her twice in April and once in early May, and Sandra called me after each meeting with a brief professional assessment. After the first meeting, he's in a difficult position, but not an unrecoverable one. He's been making aggressive moves without adequate risk assessment. I'm not seeing dishonesty. I'm seeing overconfidence. After the second, he disclosed the Garrett situation more fully today. There's legal action worth pursuing. He's resistant to it, but I think he'll come around. After the third, I think you can move forward. I'll prepare the documentation. The conditions I set were not punitive, though I want to be honest that there was a version of me that wanted them to be. There was a version of me that wanted to make Nathan feel every inch of what it had felt like to stand on a sidewalk with 2 suitcases at 68 years old. I sat with that version for a while, looked at it directly, and then chose differently. Not because I was a saint, because Daniel had asked me to look at the person Nathan might become, not only the person he had been. And because I was 68 years old and I was tired of choosing the version of myself that reached for punishment, when the version of myself that reached for honesty was harder but cleaner. The conditions were full financial transparency for the duration of the arrangement, regular meetings with Sandra, honest reporting on the Garrett situation. And one more thing, the thing Nathan had the hardest time with, the thing he sat with for a full week before calling me back to say yes. A genuine accounting of what had happened between us, Not therapy. Not a facilitated session with a mediator, though Sandra offered to arrange one. Just a real conversation, maybe more than one, in which Nathan said, out loud, without strategy, what he understood now that he hadn't understood in November. What he saw when he looked at the person he'd been in that doorway. What he thought his father had been right about, and what he thought Daniel had gotten wrong. You want me to just talk to you, Nathan said on the phone, with a quality that suggested he genuinely wasn't sure he knew how to do this. Yes. About feelings. About the truth. Call it whatever helps you show up for it. A long pause. Then quietly, that might be the hardest part of all of this. I know, I said. That's why it's the condition I care about most. He sold the penthouse in June. It didn't happen easily or quickly. The renovation, stopped mid-process when we'd agreed to pause it during Sandra's assessment, had left the interior in a state that required disclosure and negotiation. The final sale price was lower than Nathan had expected when he'd mortgaged it, though higher than it would have been without the foundational work that had already been completed. He cleared the mortgage, paid off a portion of the renovation contractor, and began legal proceedings against Garrett, which Sandra had convinced him was not optional. I found out about the sale through Sandra's monthly update, not from Nathan directly. He told me a week later, on the phone, in the flat, careful voice he used when he was managing his own emotions. It sold, he said. I heard. How do you feel? Honestly? A beat. Lighter, which is not what I expected. Where are you staying? I rented a place in Westside. It's an actual apartment, not a penthouse. Normal size, normal building. Another pause. It's fine, it's actually fine. I thought about what it must cost a man like Nathan to say those words without irony, to describe a normal apartment as fine and mean it. Good, I said. That's genuinely good. The development deal resolved in July, as Sandra had predicted it would, partially. Nathan recovered some of his capital, lost some of it permanently, and emerged with a cleaner balance sheet than he'd had in 2 years, if a considerably smaller one. Garrett's legal situation was ongoing. Nathan had stopped talking about it with the hot urgency of the early months and started talking about it the way you talk about something you've handed to the appropriate people and decided not to carry yourself. That shift alone told me something. We talked every Sunday. That had developed gradually, without either of us formally deciding it. Nathan would call on Sunday evenings the way he always had, but now the calls lasted longer and went somewhere real. He told me about the clients he was working with, smaller projects than before, more neighborhood-focused. He told me about a meeting he'd had with a community development organization that was trying to build affordable housing in the south of the city, and how he'd gone in expecting to consult briefly and had stayed for 3 hours. They know what they're doing, he said, with a surprise in his voice that told me he'd arrived expecting otherwise. They've been working this problem for 15 years. They just don't have the relationships I have on the developer side. So you could be useful. Possibly. In a different way than I'm used to being useful. Would that be so terrible? A long pause. I keep waiting for it to feel like a step down, he said. And it doesn't. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it, I said. Just let it be true. In August, nearly 10 months after Daniel's death, Nathan drove up to Caro Bay for the second time. This visit was different from April in the way that second visits are always different, less charged with the particular electricity of first confrontations, more ordinary, more real. He arrived in the afternoon in a different car, a practical sedan rather than the black SUV, and he looked at the cottage garden with the hydrangeas in full bloom and said, "You actually did all this yourself?" "Most of it," I said. "Simone from the bakery helped me with the stone path." "It looks good." "Thank you." We walked the cliff path into town, which was something I did every day, and which Nathan managed with the slightly self-conscious stride of a city person, trying to remember how to walk on uneven ground. He bought coffee at Simone's, and she greeted him the way she greeted everyone, warmly, without particular ceremony. And I watched him respond to that warmth with a genuine ease that I hadn't seen in him with strangers in a very long time. Over dinner at the cottage, I had cooked, nothing elaborate, roast chicken and vegetables from the garden. He told me something I hadn't known. "I went to see Dr. Ferris," he said. Ferris was the therapist Sandra had mentioned, the one Nathan had initially declined. "Started in May. I've been going every other week." I kept my face still. I didn't want to make too much of it, to scare him off with reaction. How is it? I asked. Hard, he said. Really hard, actually. She keeps asking me when I started believing that what I owned was the same thing as what I was worth. He pushed a piece of carrot around his plate. I don't have a good answer for that. I'm working on it. That's an important question, I said carefully. Yeah. He looked up. Dad used to say something. I don't know if you remember. He used to say, I save my noise for the things that matter. He paused. I used to think that was about being stoic, being controlled. I thought he was talking about not showing weakness. He looked at his plate. I understand now that he was talking about something completely different. I didn't respond. I couldn't, quite. I just looked at my son across the table in the cottage his father had built for me, and I thought about how long it takes to understand the people who love you, how you can spend decades living alongside someone's meaning and only reach it when they're gone. He would have liked knowing you figured that out, I finally said. Nathan nodded once. His eyes were wet. He didn't try to manage it this time, didn't straighten or press his mouth flat. He just let it be there on his face, honest and unguarded. And I thought, not for the first time, and with more certainty than before, that there was still a version of my son in there that I could find my way back to. Not fixed, not resolved, not the ending of anything, just the beginning of the longer, slower, messier work, which, it turns out, is the only kind that means anything. After Nathan left that August evening, I stood on the porch for a long time watching his headlights disappear down Cliff Road, and I thought about something Daniel used to say when we were young and arguing about money or Nathan or the future. Things we argued about the way all young couples argue, with more intensity than wisdom. He used to say, Evie, you can't fix something you're still holding on to too tight. I had always understood that as advice about letting go. It took me until I was 68 and standing on a cliff in the dark to understand that it was actually advice about grip, about knowing when your hands needed to open, not because you were giving up, but because you were finally strong enough to choose what you held. I had spent a year learning what to hold and what to release. Now I needed to figure out what to build. The foundation had been taking shape since January. Slowly, the way things built to last are supposed to take shape. Franklin had connected me with a nonprofit attorney named David Park, and together the three of us had spent the spring and summer building the legal architecture of what I was starting to call, privately, Daniel's real will. Not the document Aldridge had read in that airless office. The actual expression of what Daniel had believed and valued and wanted to put into the world. The Heart Foundation, that was its name, plain and without flourish, because Daniel had always distrusted flourish. Its purpose was two-pronged, and the two prongs had come together the way the best ideas do. Not from a single stroke of inspiration, but from the slow accumulation of things I already knew. 30 years of watching kids in under-resourced schools light up in front of a canvas. A conversation with Franklin about financial literacy and the way wealth management was a language that only certain people were taught to speak. A night at Carol's kitchen table, a bottle of open wine, Carol saying something she probably didn't know would stay with me. The cruelest thing about poverty isn't the money. It's what people don't know they don't know. The Heart Foundation would fund arts education in public schools in 4 counties. It would also fund a financial literacy program, curriculum, instructors, in-school delivery, aimed at high school students in the same districts. The two things together, arts and financial education, struck some people as an odd pairing. David Park had raised an eyebrow the first time I laid it out. Franklin had not. Franklin had simply said, that's Daniel. It was Daniel. It was also me. It was the only version of a legacy I could build that felt true to both of us. By September, the foundation had its 501c3 status, its initial board. 5 people including Franklin, Carol, David, a former colleague of mine from the school district named Rosa, and a young financial educator named Marcus, who had been running informal workshops out of a community center for 3 years and had more practical knowledge than anyone I'd met in 20 meetings with established organizations. We had our first grant cycle planned for spring. We had a budget. We had a plan. And then, 3 days after our first full board meeting, Sandra Rice called me with news I had not seen coming. The Garrett situation resolved, she said. Nathan told me it was still in litigation. It was. Until yesterday, Garrett's attorneys approached Nathan's attorneys with a settlement offer. A pause. It's not everything Nathan lost, but it's a meaningful recovery, enough to change his position substantially. I sat down at the kitchen table. How substantially? Sandra named a figure. It was not small. Nathan hasn't called you yet? Sandra asked. No. He will. Another pause. Mrs. Hart, I want to tell you something, and I'm telling you as someone who's worked with a lot of families in complicated financial situations. She paused again. Your son made bad decisions. Some of them were the decisions of an arrogant man who didn't think the rules applied to him. But he has spent the last 6 months doing something I genuinely don't see that often. He has sat with every uncomfortable truth that came up, and he has not looked away from it. That's rarer than money. I thought you should know. I held the phone after she hung up and looked at the garden through the window. October now. The hydrangeas past their peak, the first real chill coming off the water in the mornings. A year. Almost exactly a year since Daniel had died on a Wednesday, with the October leaves turning rust and honey outside our window. Nathan called 40 minutes later. You talked to Sandra, he said. She called me first. Right. A breath. So you know. I know the number. What does it mean for you practically? It means... He stopped, started again. It means I'm not in trouble anymore. Not in the way I was. He sounded like a man who had been braced for impact for so long that the absence of impact was itself disorienting. The penthouse sale, the settlement, my current projects, I'm okay. I'm actually okay. Good, I said. That's genuinely good, Nathan. Mom. His voice shifted. I want to pay you back. What I borrowed. I want to give it back. With interest, whatever Sandra says is appropriate. You don't have to. I want to. Firm. The firmness of someone who has decided something and isn't interested in being talked out of it. It's not about the money. I know you don't need it. It's about, I want the record between us to be clean. I want there to be nothing I owe you that I haven't acknowledged and settled. I was quiet for a moment. Outside, a gust off the water moved through the garden, and the gate rattled because I still hadn't fixed the latch, after all these months. Because some things you keep meaning to get to, and somehow they stay undone. All right, I said, have Sandra structure it. I trust her numbers. Okay. A pause. How are you doing? With the anniversary coming. I'm managing, I said. Some days more than others. Do you want company? For the day itself, I mean. I could come up. I thought about that. The anniversary of Daniel's death. A Wednesday in late October. A year of everything that had happened since. Yes, I said. I think I'd like that. He came up the Tuesday before, which gave us the evening to sit together without the weight of the specific date pressing on everything. We cooked dinner together, which was something we had not done since Nathan was a teenager. Me at the stove, him nominally helping but mostly in the way, asking where things were, apologizing when he nearly knocked over the olive oil. Normal. Ordinary. The kind of ordinary that you don't recognize as precious until you've gone without it long enough. Over dinner, he told me about a project he was consulting on for the community development organization, the affordable housing group he'd mentioned in the summer. They were trying to navigate a particularly complicated permitting situation, and Nathan had connections on the city council side that had been genuinely useful. He talked about it differently than he used to talk about his work. Less performance, less deal-making energy. More like someone describing something they actually cared about. They want me to join the board, he said. Officially, it would be a volunteer position. Are you going to? I think so, yeah. He turned his fork. It's strange. I used to measure everything by what it was worth. The deal value, the fee, the ROI. And this thing pays nothing, and I keep thinking about it at 3 a.m. He looked up. Dr. Ferris says that's what genuine engagement feels like. That I've been confusing excitement for engagement my whole life. She sounds sharp. She's terrifying, he said without any irony, in a useful way. After dinner, we sat on the porch with the last of a bottle of wine, and the October dark came in off the Pacific, and for a long time we didn't talk at all. Just sat there. The way I imagined Daniel would have wanted us to sit. Not performing peace, not managing anything, just two people who had hurt each other and loved each other in the particular complicated way of families. Sitting in the dark together because there was nowhere else either of them needed to be. I've been thinking about something, Nathan said finally. What? The garage. He looked at the ocean, invisible in the dark, present in its sound. You should do something with it, the space itself. Now that the cars are mostly gone, it's just sitting there. I had thought about this. The last two cars had sold in September. The Jaguar to a collector in London, the Ferrari to a museum in San Francisco that had pursued it with a persistence that Franklin had found flattering. Only the Aston Martin remained, in the climate-controlled storage unit 20 minutes from Caro Bay, under its cream cover, waiting for whatever I decided it was for. I was thinking about the foundation, I said. The space is big enough for a workshop, and it's in a neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of resources. If we put an arts program there, actual studio space, not a borrowed classroom, it would serve the community directly. Nathan was quiet for a moment. That's a good idea, he said. And then after a pause, Dad would have liked that. I think so too. Can I help? Not financially. I know you don't need that. I mean practically. The renovation, the permits, the contractor management, that's what I know how to do. I looked at him in the dark. My son. 43 years old and more honest than I had seen him be in 20 of those years. Yes, I said. I'd like that. The anniversary itself was quieter than I expected. We drove to the city in the morning. Nathan drove. I sat in the passenger seat with Daniel's letter in my inside pocket, the way I always carried it, and we went to the cemetery. It was a gray October morning, the leaves in the city at their peak color, rust and honey, the way they had been a year ago outside our bedroom window. We stood at Daniel's grave for a while. I had brought nothing, no flowers, no prepared words. I just stood there and looked at his name on the stone and had a private conversation in my head that I will keep private. Nathan stood beside me and said nothing, which was the right thing. On the way back, we stopped at a diner, a real one, the old kind with laminated menus and coffee that arrived in those thick ceramic mugs that keep nothing warm. And we sat across from each other in a vinyl booth and ate eggs and didn't talk about Daniel or the estate or the foundation or Garrett or any of the year's accumulated weight. Nathan told me about a bad date he'd had in September that made me genuinely laugh. I told him about the time Simone had tried to teach me to make beignets, and I had somehow managed to set off the smoke detector twice. Small stories. Human-sized, the kind that don't mean anything on their own, but together, accumulated over decades, are the actual substance of a relationship. I want to ask you something, Nathan said, over his second cup of coffee. And I want you to know you don't have to answer. Ask. Did you know? Even a little. When you were married to him, did you have any sense that he was doing all of this? I thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. I knew he had private things, I said slowly. Daniel always had rooms in himself that weren't fully open to me. I used to find that frustrating when we were younger. I wanted total access to someone, the way you do when you're young, and you confuse intimacy with merger. I turned my mug. Eventually I understood that the privacy wasn't distance. It was, he kept things separate so he could give them to you whole, unspoiled by process. He couldn't have given me that garage the same way if I'd watched him build it. Nathan was quiet. Did that bother you? He asked. In the end? Yes, I said. And no, I would have liked more time with the man who was building all of that. But the man I had was the same man, just showing me different rooms at different times. I got 41 years of rooms. I paused. That's a lot of rooms. Nathan nodded. He looked out the diner window at the city going past, and his face had something on it that I recognized. Not grief exactly, more like the specific ache of understanding something too late to use it. I'm going to be different with people, he said. I spent a long time treating relationships like transactions, even with you, even with Dad. He didn't look away from the window. That's the thing I'm most ashamed of, not the money stuff. The way I treated people like they were positions in a deal. I know, I said. I'm working on it. I know that too. He finally looked back at me. Is it enough? Is the working on it enough? Or is there a point where the damage is just Nathan? I waited until he held my gaze. You are my son. That is not a transaction, and it is not conditional, and it is not something that gets canceled by bad behavior, even very bad behavior. But it is also not something that excuses you from the work. I paused. The working on it is not enough on its own. The working on it combined with actually changing, that's enough. That's everything, actually. He nodded. His eyes were wet again, and again he didn't try to manage it. We sat in that diner for another hour and split a piece of pie we didn't need, and the city moved past the window in its ordinary way, and the year closed around us. In November, I drove the Aston Martin for the first time. I had been avoiding it for reasons I didn't fully understand until I was actually behind the wheel. What I understood then, with the engine running and the leather of the seat under my hands and the Pacific Coast Road stretching north, was that I had been saving it. The same way Daniel had saved his noise for the things that mattered. I had been waiting until I was sure I was driving towards something, not away from something. I was sure now. The Hart Foundation's first grant cycle had been announced that week. 11 schools across 4 counties, 230 students in the financial literacy pilot program. A waiting list for the arts program that made Rosa, my former colleague, now the Foundation's education director, send me a voice message at 7 in the morning that was mostly just her saying, Evelyn. Evelyn. Look at this list. The garage renovation had started. Nathan was managing it with the same meticulous competence he'd always brought to his work, except now with the particular care of someone doing something that mattered personally rather than professionally. He had shown me the plans in October, studio space, natural light added through a new clerestory, proper ventilation, the concrete floor we'd keep and seal again, the steel beams that would stay exposed because they were beautiful, and there was no reason to hide what something was made of. He had kept the number 14 above the door. I had asked him to. The road north to Carrow Bay was the same road I had driven in a rental car almost exactly a year ago, following the GPS and not knowing what I was driving toward. The coast highway, the city releasing me, the landscape opening up into salt and cliff, and that gray-green Pacific water. I drove with the windows cracked despite the November cold because I wanted to smell the ocean. I thought about Daniel the whole way, the way I always thought about Daniel on this road, except a year had changed the quality of the thinking. Less grief weight now, more something else. Conversation, almost. The kind you have with people you've known long enough that you don't need them to be physically present to hear their voice clearly. You built me a door, I told him, in my head, on the coast road in his dark blue car. I walked through it. I thought about the woman who had stood on a sidewalk in November with 2 suitcases and a key to a garage she had never seen. I thought about how much it was possible to lose and still find the floor. I thought about how the things that were supposed to save us, the penthouse, the status, the visible proof of a life well constructed, had been Nathan's to lose, while the things that actually saved me had been hidden in a forgotten building on a street nobody drove down on purpose. Not the money. I want to be clear about that because I think it's the part that's easiest to misunderstand. The money mattered. Of course it mattered. Money is not nothing. Financial security is not nothing. Any person who tells you otherwise has probably never gone without it. But what saved me was not the dollars. What saved me was the evidence. The physical, undeniable, $4 million evidence that I had been known. That someone had spent 12 years of quiet thought and careful action on the single project of making sure I would be all right. That kind of love is not something you can manufacture with a check. It's not something you can approximate with a goodwill or a trust fund or the right attorney. It lives in the specific details. In the photograph on the table, in the quilt with its tag still tucked in the way Franklin said he talked about you constantly, not in a sentimental way, in the way of someone trying to protect. I pulled into the cottage driveway in the late afternoon, November light low and gold on the water. The garden had gone to its winter quiet. The hydrangeas cut back, the beds mulched, the stone path clear and gray between the dormant beds. The gate needed fixing, still, after a year. I was going to fix it this week. I had the hardware in the garage. I sat in the car for a moment after the engine went quiet. Here is what I know now that I did not know a year ago. I know that grief does not end, but it changes shape. From something that fills all the available space to something that lives in a specific room that you walk past daily and sometimes enter and sometimes don't. I know that a family can break and not be over. I know that people can show you their worst and then, given the right conditions and enough honest pressure, begin to show you something else. I know that it is possible to be 68 years old and homeless on a Tuesday and financially free by Friday, and that neither condition tells you who you are. I know that the worthless thing is sometimes the only real thing. I know that the most powerful act of love is not grand or visible or performed for an audience. It is the long, private, meticulous work of making sure someone you love will be all right after you're gone. It is the 12 years of patience. It is the photograph on the table. It is trusting someone enough to give them a key and let them find out for themselves. I got out of the car. The ocean was loud today. A storm somewhere north of us was sending the swell in high and restless, and the sound carried all the way up the cliff. I stood in the driveway and breathed salt air and felt the particular cold of a November afternoon on the Pacific coast. Then I went inside and turned on every light in the cottage, because I was home and I wanted it to look that way from the road. The kettle went on. The chair by the window waited. Outside, the ocean did what it always did, enormous and continuous and completely uninterested in whether any of us were watching. It had been there before Daniel. It would be there after me. Between those two facts was everything that mattered. A life, a love, a key to a rusted door, and a woman who had learned late and hard and with considerable pain that being underestimated is only the end of the story if you let someone else hold the pen. I didn't let anyone hold the pen anymore. The kettle boiled. I made my tea. I sat in the reading chair by the window and watched the November water move, and I thought about what I still wanted to do, and how much time there might be to do it, and how little I intended to waste. Outside, the Aston Martin sat in the driveway, dark blue in the fading light. Daniel's last choice. My first freedom. Both things, at once, forever.